Okay, I think we're going to get started. Thank you so much, Christian LeBou, for picking a great song to get us started today. We really appreciate that. Um, Hello, people. We're so glad that you're here. And if this week has taught us anything, it's that elections matter, and they are so worth the time and the smarts put into them by people from all walks of life, and that includes you on this call. I'm certain that many people on this call put in a lot of time for this week's election, and we saw some really important wins. Thank you, both for your work on the elections, but also for making the time to join us today. We're hoping that today's discussion can really build on some of the wins we saw this week, and with a nice mix of practical wisdom and smart reminders, and also a little bit of hope. And especially given the devastating violence in Israel and Palestine right now, we can all always use some hope. Okay, before we dig in, a couple of logistics. The first is that this event is being recorded and everyone registered will receive it in the next day or so. And some legal stuff means that I need to say that by continuing to participate, you are consenting to being recorded. Hope that is cool with you. I think you signed in and it asked that as well. This is a discussion. So we have panelists today who will be discussing amongst themselves, but it's also a discussion with you. We are all practitioners in this work. We are all people that are trying to figure out how to do it every single day. And I know for a fact, I saw the registration list. Many of you bring ideas and brilliance along with your questions. So we hope you'll share your ideas, but we also hope you'll ask questions. And we'll be using the question feature that's at the bottom of your screen. So you just you click on that and then you add your question and or a question or a comment. It doesn't have to be a question, and we'll raise it at various points throughout. And then we'll also have more time at the end for questions and answers. And if you would like to chat over on the right, just change your settings to everyone, because sometimes people chat and it only goes to the hosts and participants. And for folks who are just joining, please feel free to add your name and where you're calling in from today. It's nice to see so many people from all over the country. It's especially nice to see people literally from all over the country, because all of this work takes us being from all takes all sorts of work from every corner of this country. So we're glad to see people from all over the place. First, though, in case you don't know, we're M&R. We're a company that's been in the do-gooder business for about 30 years. We believe in deeply and only work with nonprofits, and we believe that nonprofits are critical to solving all the biggest challenges that our world, our planet, and our people face. We also believe that nonprofits are critical to elections, and that's because so many people trust nonprofits to be doing the right thing and to be speaking with and for and on behalf of and together with real people who have real needs and real issues. And so nonprofits are such a trusted source. We do whatever it takes to engage people to make positive, progressive change in the world, whether it's organizing and advocacy, social media, fundraising, and so much more. Whatever it takes, M&R does it. And while I'm pretty much in love with everything that we do at M&R, I'm particularly excited about M&R Win, our host for today's discussion. We launched M&R Win early this year because we realized that so much of the good work that we have always done was missing a big piece. And that was really nailing the electoral strategy that is needed to make long-term social change. So we brought in the smartest and savviest folks around to launch M&R Win as a one-stop campaign strategy shop that marries high-level political strategy with the sort of expert project management strategic implementation that has been our hallmark for over 30 years. We build bespoke, high impact campaigns that build power and shift narratives and grow movements to win big in the service of systemic change. And I'm super excited that M&R Win is here today. So speaking of M&R Win, it is led by one of today's panelists, Christian LeBou. And if you don't know Christian, she's a freaking badass who has been in the trenches as NARAL Pro-Choice America's, now Repro Rights for All, campaigns and advocacy director, running campaigns at the Voting Rights Lab, working in Congress, and so much more. She also knows everything about music, and she has picked our music to start our webinar today, which was pretty great. It was a nice vibe. She's joined by Kate Ryan, Vice President at M&R Win, who also has a pretty amazing legislative background at NARAL, along with National Women's Health Network and in the U.S. House of Representatives. And also she is excellent at karaoke, in case anyone doesn't know that. Ankur Asthana is M&R's Vice President in Digital Organizing and has worked with causes like Planned Parenthood, Center for Popular Democracy, on immigration rights, increasing union rights for all, among others. And finally, Nihal Mahmood, who leads our M&R's audience and message research work here. But she brings a sort of infectious and insatiable curiosity about what makes people do what they do from long experience, deep experience with major brands in a variety of sectors. And we're lucky she's brought her brand experience into the do-gooder experience. So we're going to go ahead and get started. As I said, this is a discussion. So we'll ask our panelists some questions. We'll include you and invite you to ask some questions as well. But I want to start with having Christian LeBoux kick us off. Christian.
Yeah, thanks, Madeline. So when we began talking about this webinar internally, the image of a dumpster fire was flying around Slack on our team. And because if I were to mention, right, the machinations of the House of Representatives, or more specifically, the current leadership of it over the past few weeks, it is and remains a real dumpster fire. And we've certainly been watching what feels like a really scary, sometimes funny, but mostly scary parody of government. But it is a proof point that our democracy is in crisis. But I want to take a minute to view that dysfunction and the signal that it's sending about the durability of our democratic systems in the context of what voters themselves told us this past Tuesday, because I really believe in listening to people. And as Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley, one of my favorite people from here in Massachusetts, always says, those closest to the pain should be closest to the power. So we listened to voters because they spoke, and they spoke quite forcefully and sent some really clear signals about the path forward. And what I heard is that there is reason to be hopeful. There is reason for hope. Voters expressed via their choices at the ballot box, certainly with direct referendums and candidate elections, their expectation that people in power have to continue to make progress in this long march towards justice that we're all on. They affirmed their expectation that those in power continue to govern in the interest of the majority. And they set a really clear expectation that our fundamental freedoms have to be protected and expanded. Tuesday's election demonstrated what people will and will not tolerate, and it really showed just how far off base extremist electeds and candidates are from their constituents. I really heard the voters saying, we've had enough, right? We've had enough of the denial of access to abortion, of undermining voting rights, of undermining our trans brothers and sisters, of undermining truth in education. They've had enough. And we know this because the results speak for themselves. In Ohio, which is maybe one of the marquee races of the night, right? In a Republican trifecta state, in 56% to 43% of voters approved a ballot initiative to enshrine a right to abortion in the Constitution. This is going to ensure that a 6-week abortion ban with no exceptions will not be able to go into effect. That's concrete policy win that will change people's lives and save lives. In Kentucky, a state with a Republican-controlled state legislature, voters reelected a Democratic governor, Andy Beshear. He took many actions as governor to protect and defend fundamental freedom. He leaned into his support for abortion rights, but he also highlighted critical economic issues, particularly infrastructure investments, that really resonated throughout his campaign. In Pennsylvania, Dan McCaffery was elected to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. This race in Pennsylvania, a critical state for us in 2024, is also going to be a critical backstop to protect voting rights and ensure election integrity. There were incredibly important wins for LGBTQ plus rights. There was the rejection of anti-trans rhetoric in many campaign ads, in particular in Kentucky. There was the defeat of school board book bans in municipal races and school board races around the country. And in my particular favorite, which we'll talk about more later, in Virginians, they really showed out for us on Tuesday, and they sent a clear and forceful rebuke to Governor Glenn Youngkin, because they not only held the state Senate, but they locked in Democratic control of the state assembly. And in these races, candidates focused again on the issues that all of us are fighting for: abortion access, climate justice, education, and the future of our kids. And I don't want us to fall into the trap, right, of believing our own hype, because we have to not overemphasize that we're talking to ourselves. I love talking to folks like everyone who's on this webinar, because we all think and feel relatively similarly, doing similar work. We have to continue to speak to our base, but we also have to focus our energy on persuasion and turnout of the folks who will make a difference in close races around the country. The persuadables, new and infrequent voters, So I'm optimistic, but I'm also incredibly realistic. It's going to be important for us to remember that while every single election that we've had post Dobbs, which is the SCOTUS case that overturned Roe, which to me is just a real dividing line in American political history at this point, those elections might have defied the odds because the leading Republican candidate and former president of the United States has not been on the ballot for any of these elections. And we cannot underestimate what that wild card will mean when forecasting our work ahead. The electorate next year for a presidential campaign year is going to be larger, it's going to be less liberal, and it will be made up of people who are less engaged in politics than the folks who vote in off-year elections. It will also include more people who vote as much on gut instincts and, yes, party affiliation as they do on policy positions. And this means that we have to begin laying the groundwork for 2024 right now. So this week's results do give us a framework to begin mapping our strategies and how we need to win going into 2024. And I've been able to distill this down for myself into 3 things. 1, voters are motivated by the issues impacting them directly. And it's why I love working with nonprofits and with nonprofit advocacy organizations and C4s, because our focus is on the issues, and issues win elections. People vote their values, and when you give them a clear set of those values to align with, they will demonstrate that at the voting box. 2, it's imperative on us to remind voters of the impact of their ballot. It's not enough to only talk to voters in cycle. We have to do the hard work in between elections of engaging our friends, our neighbors in the entire cycle of advocacy, right? Organizing, agitating in neighborhoods, finding commonalities and ways of engaging that are not just about elections. We have to tell the story of how the vote they cast is tied to the votes that are decided in their state legislatures, that impacts how their children learn and whether folks can pay their bills and provide for their families. I heard something really compelling by the CEO of Voto Latino, Maria Teresa Kumar, recently. She said, we are litigating 20th century problems instead of addressing 21st century issues. We did not get to this crisis point overnight. And so we as advocates have to take the long view to reclaiming our democracy. And my third point, I'm going to go back to where we started, is that there is reason to be hopeful. And let's share that hope, right? Our vision for the world when we win is by nature aspirational. I want to join that party with you. It's our job to bring voters on that journey so they see themselves reflected in our work, in the tactics we're using in order to create change, and they're able to find some joy in the midst of so much despair. We have to capture this momentum because our opposition deals and thrives in fear, chaos, disruption, and misinformation. And so, as we tap into all of the tools and technology and platforms that we have at our disposal, we have an opportunity to speak directly to people in ways that previous campaigners and even myself, when I was a baby organizer, could not have even dreamed of at the beginning of my career. And we have to use that to tell the story and paint the picture of the world that we are co-creating together. I'm really excited to have this discussion, and I'm going to turn it back over to Madeline to get us started.
Yeah, we're going to start digging in on some questions. And so once again, I want to remind you that this is a discussion, and that means that you are part of that discussion. Please feel free to add your questions in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We will amplify those questions for our panelists. But first, I just want to say, Christian, thank you so much for reminding us of the victories. I think it's really easy for us to immediately get back into the Sturm and Drang of daily life, and so much happening that is hard, that reminding us of those victories. Yesterday, we rehearsed this webinar, and we were really pretty hopeful and excited. And even today, one day later, we're all like, okay, I'm starting to get grim again. So let's just remember these victories. I'm glad that you named them for us. It's really important. And also for anyone who is working on those, please take a victory lap, especially at least for me, working on abortion rights my whole damn life. And to see that happen in Ohio was really, really exciting and important. But everyone deserves a victory lap. I know that many of you were involved in some of these, and just take that moment to really recognize the role that you played and how much each person's activity and hard work really, really matters. But I'm going to jump into the questions now. Okay, so we know this. We hear this every day, and heard in Christian's opening about just the importance of the 2024 election. And there is so much to do. And so let's just zoom out a level and start at the very beginning, as they say. How do you get started? If you're just thinking about, I mean, many of you are already thinking about this, but if you are just thinking about what is the role that me and my nonprofit are going to play, I mean, you're starting to craft your advocacy roadmap for next year. How do you get started? And I'm going to pick on Kate for this question.
Happy to. Thank you, Madeline. So one thing that I would really advise organizations to do is get really clear on your goals, and not just for the cycle itself, but ideally you're thinking about how the election fits into your larger organizational theory of change and the type of change you're seeking, right? Whether that's policy change, whether that is narrative or culture change. I know from experience that it's really easy to jump right into sort of the metrics and the tactics and sort of skip over the bigger picture pieces and instead go to, what nonpartisan voter guides do we want to do? Who's going to write them? And how are we talking to our members? How many? Through which channels? And jump right down into the specifics. But I think it's really essential to first sort of set goals that play to the long term, right? What is your org going to achieve this election year? Yes, but not just candidates if you're, endorsing candidates, but also about what question, sort of what is your theory of change? How does it relate to your electoral work? How does it fit within your organization's mission and goals? Essentially, in December of 2024, what story do you want to be able to tell about your organization's engagement with the election, your organization's impact on the policy issue you care about and how it was talked about in the election, how it played a role in votes, sort of what is within your locus of control, and what impact do you want your nonpartisan or partisan electoral work to have on the policy advocacy, right? That life cycle advocacy. We're electing folks, as Christian just said, to govern. So what are we doing in the 2024 election cycle that sets us up and sets you up for policy progress in 2025? And so these goals will ensure that you're sort of doing the most impactful work in the long term, but also, and M&R loves metrics, that your metrics are measuring the right things. And so being really clear on those goals means your metrics can tell as clear a story as possible a year from now.
Kate, thank you. And I just want to say thank you specifically for really hammering on this goals question, which I bet that a lot of people on this call might be saying, oh, of course we set goals. Of course we do. But let's really be honest that we have all worked in organizations where we do sort of skip that part of saying, what is the actual goal that is right? Not just we want to elect this president and we have a role to play, but what is your unique role? Who is your audience and who's your unique role for doing that? And I've worked with many organizations who are always jumping in. We want to build a website that does this thing. And you're like, okay, but why? And that is a really critical question in a discipline that is hard to actually maintain, because it's hard to get clear on your goal, because that means getting really specific and agreeing. So Kate, I just want to say thank you for hammering on goals. All right. So that said, what does it really mean to create a goal that's achievable? It's like, what's the right goal for your organization, for your nonprofit? And Ankur, how about you?
Yeah, so I think we need to start by looking at what our supporters are feeling and where they're at. We have to be real about what they're going through, and that allows us to be able to set achievable goals, right? So I think that's different for each organization, each issue, each community. For example, for me personally, just right now, a lot of the communities that I'm connected to are feeling really devastated and disillusioned by the ongoing atrocities in Palestine, and are feeling disillusioned with both political parties, about the lack of a meaningful response. And that could change. A year is a long time in politics, as we all know. But as an organizer, I have to know that if I'm hoping to mobilize these communities in 2024, I need to understand that turning out for just a candidate or just a party may not be the main motivating factor for folks. And I need goals that reflect that reality. And again, this differs, I think, from community to community, issue to issue, but I think what it generally points to is the importance of setting goals that are focused on building for the long term and are really focused on issues, as Christian talked about, that directly impact folks. And so for me, when I think about goals, that really shifts the way that I think about goal setting. Instead of setting goals that are only focused on, things like we have to win this election or we have to win this particular seat, which are important, you can also set goals like we will use this election to elevate our policy position and our issue in the public discourse, or we'll grow our advocate base around this issue by 20% over the course of the year, or we'll just use this election to level up our existing supporter base's skills and leadership so that we're in an even stronger place to be able to win after election day. And I think one of the examples I think of is the labor movement, which I think just does this really well, cycle after cycle. We're very lucky at MNR to be able to work with some incredible economic and racial justice campaigns that have won enormous victories for workers across industries and across states, things like higher wages, better benefits, collective bargaining rights, a real seat at the table. And part of the reason why I think these campaigns have been so successful is because they're really strategic about how they use elections to advance their issues for the long term. Just one concrete example of that, I think that the labor movement has done really well is a lot of times our clients in that space leverage worker actions during an election year. So things like strikes or walkouts by inviting candidates to join and speak at those actions. And strategically, it serves two purposes. First, it does help get candidates on the record, hopefully in support of worker demands. But second, it attracts press, it attracts attention digitally, and elevates the demands and the issue during the election cycle. And I think long-term, that impact is that even if a particular candidate doesn't win that particular race, the issue and the policy demand still move closer to becoming a reality because more people are aware of it, more people are in support of it, and more people are ready to take an active role in advocating for that change even after election day is over.
Yeah, I'd love to jump in on this here because Ankur and I work on a lot of clients together with this, and it often feels like we have to have what we and my family call like real talk, right? Like, how are we going to win this loss? We're not going to win everything. If our goal is to win a seat, great. You also have to be able to articulate why winning that particular seat is going to enable a particular policy change or maybe defeat an opponent to progress. Oftentimes, we know that a loss can enable larger narrative or cultural change, right? A really powerful example of this played out this week in the Virginia elections. I live in Boston. I don't live in the DC media market, but I'm from DC, so I was down quite a bit. And I bet those of you who live in DC were absolutely inundated and are glad that it's over by candidate ads, right? And I was watching TV. And I noticed that every single Democratic ad for a state legislative candidate was about abortion. Every single one. Every Republican ad was about crime, right? Was about fear and sort of this like fear of the other and a playbook that they have realized really works for them. Each of these issue movements and the political parties that they are sort of representing have figured out something critical, right? And we saw it at play. Reproductive freedom advocates have learned that talking about abortion drives votes. It outs extremists, it defines your opposition, and it's now a part of a larger cultural conversation about freedom. This isn't by accident. It's part of a longer-term strategic set of choices that folks in the reproductive freedom movement, the reproductive justice movement, and folks and advocates have made and tested over and over again via extensive research and have real message discipline about. I'm currently working with a client who is hoping to inspire like that same kind, right, of movement message discipline and ultimately the kind of political and narrative change that's necessary about crime. This organization is utilizing message research to combat the fear-mongering narratives that showed up in those ads that I saw. They're trying to equip lawmakers and folks running for office with the messages and talking points that reframe crime in ways that resonate with voters, but also tills the soil and sort of enables the kind of community-based policy solutions that will actually make communities safer. So they're enabling the policy change via narrative change and political engagement. And that's the work of multiple cycles, right? They're not going to win every race. They're not going to win in every space that they're in, but they know that that kind of long view and repetition is absolutely essential to enabling the political and policy change that they're seeking.
So important, that message discipline and that repeated message, which is a perfect way for me to segue into asking Nihal if you would like to talk a little bit about what you think the role of really understanding your audiences and that all important message research and messaging testing is in building campaign strategy, particularly with election. I know it's important everywhere, but particularly with election. What do you think?
Yeah, audience and message research plays an essential role in this work, and Christian gave some wonderful examples of research in action. The messages you're seeing out in the wild aren't a case of throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks. But before I get into the role of research and campaign strategy, I want to make sure everyone understands what we mean when we say audience research and message research. First, it's really important to take the time to learn about your audiences and their perspectives, aka audience research, to help you understand them on a deeper level. We can't rely on assumptions or past experiences because things around us are changing so quickly, and what may have been true 6 months ago or even a month ago, to be honest, may not be the case today. We don't know where people stand on things. And on top of that, we can't treat audiences as a monolith because even those who share similar demographic profiles can have entirely different values, experiences, and outlooks. So once you do that audience research, you can use what you've learned about your audiences to inform your messaging. And this allows your audiences to feel seen and heard, which is powerful in itself. But then the work doesn't just stop there. Audience research tells you who your people are and gives you insight into what they need to hear. But in a crowded digital landscape, as you all know, with so many things competing for your audience's attention, it's really crucial we understand how to present that message so that it's noticed, absorbed, and remembered. Message research allows you to identify which messages are most compelling for your audiences and crucially, which could cause a backlash effect so that you can focus your resources and efforts on the messages that are most likely to motivate and move people. Now, after I've said all of that, you may be wondering which type of research you should be doing and when. Some questions you could ask yourself to figure this out include, when would I want my campaign to go live? Do I need to learn more about my audiences because of some gap in knowledge? Am I confident that my messaging will connect with my audience? And by connecting, that also means that you're using language that you're certain your audience will understand, which may or may not be the language your organization uses internally. Obviously, these questions are high level, but your answers will guide you in the right direction. Another thing about timing is that ideally, you want to conduct your research as close to campaign launch as possible, obviously taking into account the planning process and the steps for design and all of that. But again, because things are constantly changing, you also want to keep in mind, though, that doing the research only once may not be enough. You'll want to account for some flexibility in your planning approach so that you can rapidly iterate on your campaign in real time if your data indicates that there's a shift. This is really essential. And then lastly, let's take the concept of voter fraud as an example to highlight why message research matters. For some in the Black community, voter fraud might sound like a veiled attempt at voter suppression, while conservative folks may see it as a means to safeguard fair elections with voter ID laws. Even with the same words, not everyone interprets them in the same way. That's why selecting the right words is really important when you want to effectively connect with your audience.
Thank you so much, Nihal. I want to jump in on your very smart point. And the conversation, to kind of tie it back to the sort of conversation about the long goal setting that we were talking about at the beginning, because I think critical to your efforts will often be the creation of what we like to call the sort of strategic surround sound, right? So message research can ensure that your messages are tailored to your audience, if you use smart like Nihal. But you want to come at them from also every angle, right? Your tailored messaging is only as effective as you want it to be if it actually gets to the right person, right? And so some people, we know, receive their information on a broad variety of channels. So some people are watching real live actual TV. Some people are on YouTube, TikTok 2 weeks later on Instagram. So I think that smart campaigns and organizations, so many of you on the call are really thinking about how to utilize message research. And a big piece of it is not just the research, but how it plays out in practice, right? Message discipline. And I speak from experience, I worked in the repro space and a bunch of other spaces in the nonprofit sector. And so I know that message discipline is hard and it takes a lot of work with partners and allies. And I also want to note that message discipline doesn't mean that everybody has to say the exact same thing, right? So discipline doesn't mean that everyone says the exact same tagline all the time. Different organizations have different voices, different perspectives, their differentiated role in the movement. A litigating group is not going to talk about an issue the same way a healthcare provider group is going to talk about the same issue, is not the same as a group that's primarily grassroots, even if they're all in the same sector and movement space. And that's actually important. You want the variety of voices, but you want them to be not just complementary, but really mutually reinforcing. The message discipline in a movement, kind of when you can gather that, and then actually having that out in the world, right? Working with candidates to make sure that voters are hearing that message from you, but they're also hearing it from candidates, and framing the language in the way that on the campaign trail in the way that works because you tested it. And frankly, also how the media is talking about it. Many people are getting the way they talk about and think about an issue is coming from the media. So that means intentional candidate and reporter education to ensure message discipline, that it really sinks in. It's that repetition, hearing it from everybody, repeat. And I recognize that that's not a one cycle goal, right? Messaging and narrative change takes place over years and several cycles. But that does mean that going into 2024, it's great for testing because you can improve, you can iterate, repeat it, get a sense of what is sticking, what isn't, where there were assumptions. And so that way, these electoral year goals should and can ladder up to your long-term goals so that you may not win, as Christian said, right? You're not going to win every race, but you can really move the needle in the messaging and narrative change space.
Once again, I love that you're hammering this too, Kate, the message discipline. We're really bad at this in the nonprofit world. And it's not because we're bad at messaging. It's because we get bored and we start to hear the same thing over and over again. And we sort of assume that the people we're talking to get bored as well. And they might be getting bored, but that's actually what you want, is you want people to know it so well that they're like, oh, that again. And if I always say that if I don't actually truly hate my message by the time the election day rolls around, then I haven't done my job. And that's a good thing. You want to actually hear it so much that you can't bear to hear it again. That's how things worm their way into brains and become just second nature to folks. So just hammering that message discipline is such a great point. But let's say we've done that. Let's say we've actually really done that message discipline. And we've got folks really listening. You've got a base of people who are listening to you and your organization and what you have to say and repeating the things that you say. How do you really then engage them throughout an election year? It's long. People get tired. They might get distracted. How do you build that, really engage that base in election year that builds toward those long-term policy wins? What are some of the tactical ideas that we have here in this group for organizing and mobilizing in election years? And I'm hoping people may have some ideas in our chat, and also, but I'm going to start with Ankur, our chief.
Yeah, there really are. There are so many ways, and yet there's this, we can have a whole separate conversation about tactics. I know that's sometimes the most fun part to brainstorm around, but the first thing I'll say though is on the digital organizing side, we know from the research, from places like the Analyst Institute, for example, that there are lots of best practices when it comes to the last few weeks of the cycle and getting people out to vote, right? So we know, for example, that GOTV efforts are most effective typically in the last 2 weeks before election day. We know that you should mix different modes of contact, texting plus phone plus social pressure mailers, because you lose effectiveness the more you use the same medium again and again. And these are tactics that are well researched. There are a lot of organizations that are implementing it, and it's great. But I think where we can do better is this piece that we're talking about around bringing that intention to mobilizing and organizing well before and after election day, not just being focused on that compressed time period of a couple of weeks or a month. And so the way I think about it, there's a few buckets of tactics that I find worth considering when we're mapping out our organizing or engagement programs with clients in the broader arc of an election year. The first bucket I think of is narrative engagement, as Nihal and Kate were talking about. One of the first things organizations can do is get clear about what their message is and start driving it consistently throughout the year. And this isn't just for the purpose of moving the public in your area or decision makers on your issue. It's also valuable from a base building perspective. It's actually important that your supporters are seeing that message and narrative too, because it allows them to understand your issue and frame it in the ways you need them to. And so that's why for many programs that we work with, we recommend using digital advertising and other tools to retarget your own supporter base, as well as reaching new folks, folks like your social media subscribers or your email subscribers with your messaging, because it's laying that groundwork for future engagement. The second bucket then that I think of a lot is building your supporter base's muscles. It's kind of like working out before a big event, right? So most organizations have moments well before election day that can serve as really great practice runs for the kinds of activities that you might do closer to election day, like getting out the vote or knocking on doors. And so on the C4 policy advocacy side, for folks who are in that space, those moments can be things like state legislative sessions that are happening in the spring. We worked with clients to launch volunteer peer-to-peer texting programs in the spring of an election year that's focused around a piece of legislation, so that they can set up the infrastructure needed for recruiting, for training, for supporting volunteers to do texting at scale. And it usually takes a few months to work out all those kinks, but by the time election day rolls around, those folks are pros at it. They've trained hundreds of dedicated volunteers who can drive millions of voter contacts. And the same thing is true on the C3 side too. It can look like that in an education context. So we worked with one organization during the height of the COVID pandemic, actually, where we were setting up weekly virtual phone banks focused on education around the vaccine. And so volunteers learned how to use phone banking and the tools associated with that to have a phone conversation on a tricky subject at the time and how to handle some tough questions. And those skills were really useful later on when it was time to do phone banking for voter registration efforts, for example, and getting people motivated in a political context too. They had a ready-made base of folks that they could deploy pretty quickly. So it can work in different contexts. The last thing I'll say is, I think it's just very important to have a plan for after election day. So often we all put everything we have into the months and weeks leading up to election day, and then it's over and we don't really have a plan to engage supporters, and we lose some of that energy and even infrastructure that we've built up. And so, it's totally reasonable to need a break. I think we all deserve that after an intensive election period, but just having a few simple touch points between election day and the end of the year, I think can be really helpful in setting up for future engagement. And, examples of that can be something really simple, like a webinar where you just create space for people to share how they're feeling about the election results. And that can be sadness, it can be joy, it can be, a mix of things. Or you can host a celebration for your most dedicated volunteers that really lifts up the impact that they had. And, these kinds of things can not only make your base feel valued, but also ultimately help to make sure that your base is ready to engage in whatever is coming next.
Yeah, the approach that Ankur outlined also pays dividends in a legislative context, right? We should always be asking ourselves, we're building power to what end, right? You're setting your folks up to connect the dots. How will the actions that they take in the cycle, voting for a candidate who supports the issues you're advocating for, is tied to the change they're seeking? You're looking for them to be primed to carry that energy into the next phase of your work. And it's a real cycle of accountability. We don't just elect people to elect them, we elect them to do the work, and we hold them accountable to what they promised us in the cycle. So when I go in to make a legislative ask in January, I need to be able to point back to what was said on the campaign trail. Right now, I'm working with a client on childcare funding, which is, of course, a long-term appropriations effort. But we're also thinking really critically about the election in the context of that work. What does it look like for someone to be a childcare voter? What does it mean to vote on this issue and then hold those same elected officials to account when Congress goes back into session next year? You have to be able to say in your lobby meetings, for those who do that, or just your educational meetings you take with elected officials, look how much voters cared about this. Your constituents care about it, and you need to be able to quantify that in a really tangible way. Your base and the folks you activate need to be able to say themselves, right, directly to elected officials, I voted for you because of this issue. It matters to me. This organization matters to me, and we expect you to follow through on your campaign promise. And then just to speak and connect it back to the surround sound that Kate mentioned earlier, you want them to hear that message this year, next year, in the fall at GOTV, and then they're going to bring it all back together in January of 2025 when we all are supposed to get to the work of governing. So it's critically important, both the repetition, but also connecting your base to those activities.
Yeah, right on. I love the notion of really thinking about people, like allowing organizations to really think about who they are in this election. And especially when, like, you're talking about childcare funding, it's finding those people for whom childcare is really their number one issue, and being able to really like inspire them and also invite them to continue to engage in that. And just knowing that there are people that for them, that is most important, and that's what impacts their lives. So really, just really exciting to hear what you're doing, Christian. Okay, I know I've got a bunch of questions lined up, but I want to do just one thing before we get to some of the questions, which is just like a quick one sentence or two about, if you know, your burning ambition, your burning desire that you want to see happen in the road to victory in 2024. I'll start with Kate.
Thank you. For me, it is kind of exactly what Christian says, a great jumping off point. It's that you really want to root your electoral goals in your long-term advocacy goals, because voters don't vote to vote. They vote because they want to see something happen. And your supporters are doing that because they care about your issue. And so for them, being able to see tangible policy change associated with their engagement in your electoral program, that's what keeps them there with you.
Ankur.
Yeah, I love that. And you know, as I think about next year, it feels like engaging our base and our supporters meaningfully now will pay off long term. So not just waiting, you know, till the last few weeks before election day, where it feels kind of transactional to ask for someone's support, but really investing in the base building relationships and infrastructure needed ahead of time, I think will just make that huge difference, not only in 2024, but also beyond.
Nihal, hit us.
I would say take the time to get to know your audiences and to learn if your messages resonate with them. It'll have a huge impact on your efforts and make your campaign way more efficient.
And Christian, why don't you bring us home?
All right. I would say no tactics without a why. Don't get so busy doing all the things that we all love to do without a clear sense of how they fit into your long-term strategy. The key question is always, to what end? Why are we holding this press conference? Who are we speaking to? What will this action do for our ability to build long-term power, pass that bill, elect that person? It goes a long way to guarding against burnout and keeping both your staff and your team connected and inspired, as well as your supporters.
Right on. Well, we do have some questions, but if you do have a question that you want to ask, it can be about what we've already said or something completely different. You can use the question and answer. And if you have a comment or an example or an inspiring moment, use the Q&A at the bottom of the screen as well. I want to get this one out of the way that we knew was coming, y'all, which is, can you speak a little to some ways you can share that messaging frameworks with candidates without crossing C3, C4 compliance lines that prevent nonprofits from doing the wrong thing, which we knew we were going to get. And so I think, Christian, I'm going to call on you with that one.
Sure. I will caveat this by saying I am not your lawyer, but I have managed to stay out of election jail for 20 plus years. So take that for what you will. I think there are lots of ways that C3s can get their messages out there, certainly through earned and paid media strategies. It's not always going to be handing a set of talking points over to a candidate. You can publish messaging toolkits and guides on your website so that they are publicly available, and then do, outreach in a really C3 compliant way. There are ways that you can sort of infiltrate sounds really negative, that you can utilize existing, candidate and campaign training apparatus to train folks who are working with candidates, right, on your messages and the sort of message and narrative work that you do. I would highly encourage folks, this is just a shout out to my friends at Boulder Advocacy and Alliance for Justice, that they are an incredible resource for nonprofits on where the bright lines are and where you can live in the gray, but really thinking about how you can provide your messages as a service to everyone, knowing, right, that our opposition is not likely to sort of catch on, and then you can do more targeted outreach, either utilizing a C4, or another way to do that would be to work with a partner who has a C4 and who has some electoral capacity on your behalf.
Yeah, right on. And yes, it's true, Christian is not a lawyer, but damn, that sounded really good, Christian. Pretty good. All right. So another question that we have is, I'm worried that voters receive an overwhelming amount of, in particular, text messages. And all of us can probably relate and nod our heads and say, holy moly, there's a lot of text messages. And I'm gonna, the question is, do they still work? And do people hate them? And I'm gonna ask Ankur, who has probably done more text
Up in
messages
here.
than
Yeah.
anyone in the world. So I'm gonna go ahead and let
Yeah.
you answer that.
No, it's a fair question. I think a couple of things. I think unfortunately part of the problem is that there are a lot of examples out there of not great uses of texting, especially in the election context. And when I say not great uses, what I really mean is particularly with cold leads. So folks who have not opted into a program or who have not really consented to receive messaging that are getting spammed with messages 3 months out from an election date. And from the research we've seen, again, from places like the Analyst Institute, that kind of approach not only doesn't annoys people, but it can have effects on unsubscribe rates. It can get people disengaged. So we definitely don't want that. And I think by and large, most organizations that probably are here and we work with are thinking about messaging warm leads. So the folks that are really your supporters that are opted in to receive your messages and who you're engaging with hopefully on an ongoing basis. And I think there the research is clear that messaging people at appropriate times about the appropriate information they need. So for example, before a voter registration deadline or close to election day is a net benefit. It does increase turnout rates, for example, if you do it in the last 2 weeks in particular. And so again, like everything, you should test and see what works for your audiences, right? There might be some folks within your broad supporter pools that really respond well to that, and others who benefit from other forms of communication or different cadence as well. So it really depends, but I think generally text messaging closer to election day still a net positive, especially with those folks that have consented to receive messaging from you, and hopefully collectively as kind of an industry and as a movement we can cut down on some of those not so great practices.
Yeah, right on. So next question for y'all. What if I'm a smaller entity, like a regional or a state-based organization? What's my job here? How do I compete with folks who are spending so much more than me on an issue? What do you think is the best use of my limited resources? And I'm going to, the universal symbol for someone that's going to answer this question is that they unmute their mic, but no one has. So now I'm going to pick on somebody, and it's going to be Kate.
I'm happy to. So I think that's really great. I think it kind of goes back to focusing on your locus of control, right? If you are sort of something, a regional nonprofit or state-based nonprofit, you are a trusted voice in your community, in your state, in a way that, frankly, larger national groups have a different relationship, frankly, and are seen differently by members of the community. So when it comes down to engaging in electoral work, or sort of this idea of electoral work in service of governing and policy change, communicating with your folks and using this electoral education, if you're C3 or C4, you can do this in a variety of compliant ways, building up your base around elections when folks are paying attention and increasing the education on your issues, on your policy, your messaging, communicating with the folks that you're talking to. We don't want to get so focused on national elections that we forget about state and local elections, because we also know that the work being done by local elected officials is impacting your supporters, your members, however you're structured, daily lives in a really real way. I also couldn't take this question and not point to school boards. Like if you're a parent of young children, which I am, I've never been more concerned with school boards in my life. So the idea of, I actually think there's a really important critical role to play for groups that are state-based smaller groups, because that's, I would argue that conservatives have utilized local politics and local spaces in a way that I think we need to disrupt. And so, yeah, so I think that's really critical, actually.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I think that this goes back to a theme that I've seen running through all of your comments so far, which is around this understanding of who you are and what your role is, and being able to say no to what you can't do and being okay with that. Because I think there's sometimes I've worked in regional organizations where there's like, yes, but what are we doing for the presidential election? And I'm sort of like, that we don't have that reach. Like our reach is here. And so being able to really focus that is a hard thing, because it means saying no to things. And the thing about a lot of us is that we want to do dang everything. So I really like that really understanding your locus of control. Okay, I've got another question, which is a big one, which is how do we counteract the huge impact of disinformation? And again, I'm going to look and see who's unmuted their microphone. No one has, so I'm going to, oh, Nihal, woohoo, Nihal wins.
Yeah,
It's like
I can do this
competition.
one. I think it's like an issue that's at the top of mind of so many people. And what I would say is, and I'm going to sound like a broken record, but the answer is rooted in your audience. And so if you're messaging, if you really understand your audience and what their lived experiences are, what their perspectives are, and incorporate that into your messaging, you may not even have to take a reactive stance. I think that a lot of people tend to feel like, oh my gosh, they're saying this, we need to respond exactly to what they're saying. Maybe you don't need to. And a way for you to understand that is through your message research. It's a great way to inoculate your audience as well, because part of the message research and angle that you can do is test with the opposition message and then have your message as well and see how people are responding. And that will help guide you towards the right approach when it comes to your messaging and how to counter that disinformation, whether you need to address it directly, whether you just completely continue on your own path and hammer the same message over and over again that you were doing originally. That the research will help guide the way and show you the light, as cliche as that sounds.
And I know, Nihal, that you are a researcher and insatiably curious, as we said earlier. And so the research is always the answer. But honestly, it always is. It really is always the answer. And one thing that Nihal and I have found out in some research that we've done lately is that people don't understand a lot of the words that we use. And so, for example, I found out that for many people don't know the words grassroots. So we might think we're countering disinformation with words that people get, but they're understanding the disinformation words and they're not understanding the words that we're using. And so lots of words that we use, movement building, grassroots, things like that, people don't necessarily know what those words mean, and being able to understand that, because we might think, okay, but we're counteracting this, and really it's just gibberish to people. So being able to test those getting really down and dirty into the words themselves really does matter here. So that's just yeah, another thing that we all learn. Okay, here's one. I feel like my organization gets stuck with deciding on a unified message. How do we get past that? Christian.
Yeah, I feel like so much of what we're saying is like building on each other, right? But I think that key to deciding on a unified message is being really clear, to many of my colleagues' points here, on your unique role in the electoral space and the movement in the sector that you're working, and having some really difficult conversations on the front end of your campaigning to really align on goals, right? And so the messages that you use should actually drive towards whatever the goalpost is for your organization. And that's a place that, I'll just be honest, we can help. That's a lot of what we do here at M&R-Win, is to really think about how do we ask the critical questions that can bring folks into alignment, to have those and facilitate some of those difficult conversations that really surfaces where there might not be complete alignment within an organization, so that you can sort of air that, get that out on the table, and start to build a unified plan and message that will get you on the path to winning. But it really is about leaning into some of the discomfort that you're not going to have all the answers on the front end, that you're going to engage someone really smart like Nihal to, help you figure out your audience and your message, but that you all have to be really clear and on the same page and know that you are on the same team marching towards the same goal at the end.
We just have a couple minutes left, but I wanted to raise a question and two questions that came up with us, which one was about sharing some of the resources and research that we've mentioned from Alliance for Research, Analysts Institute, et cetera. When we send out our email with the recording, we will include some of these resources. So let's make sure that we do that. Because I know we said a lot of things, and so that's a good call to make sure that we list those. And then similarly, we had a question about what the best way is for small grassroots organizations and the agencies who advise them to test messaging without spending tons and tons of money. And I know Nihal has a longer answer to this, but I did want to say, I think that what we can also do in our message tomorrow is provide a couple of resources there. Because you can do so much research testing online, there are ways to do it. There are tools out there that are less expensive than having, in-person focus groups somewhere. There are things that you can do. And we'll include some resources. But Nihal, in 1 minute or more, there's anything else you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think that like a really good way to do it, like I think any research is good, like research to inform you, so you don't need to do all the bells and whistles. One thing I would say is bare minimum testing messages with your audiences, just like live, which is a little bit unfortunate if there's a little bit of backlash, but that's one way to do it. Another is through a survey, again, with your email list. You can do the message testing on your own and without using one of those tools that we obviously will share tomorrow. But yeah, just leveraging your email list and your supporters, they do want to help. And so if you can maximize that, and that'll help stretch your dollar as well.
Yeah, right on. It is 1 minute before the hour, and that means that our time together is over today. And it went so fast. I really appreciate everyone taking the time together today to participate in this conversation. This is the beginning of conversations that we're hoping to have throughout the election year. We hope you join us for others. If you have ideas of things that you would love for us to cover, we're always game to do that. Here's the contact information for our amazing panelists. I do want to thank our behind the scenes people, Laura Clavan and Julia Allenby, for making everything work correctly. Thank you so much. And here's to an amazing next 12 difficult, but also hopefully exciting months. So thanks everyone. And thanks to our panelists. Hope to see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.